The security director thought he was stopping an unwanted stranger at the gate that morning, but within minutes, he would realize he had just humiliated the most powerful woman in the entire company. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Rain drifted softly across downtown Chicago as thousands of employees poured into the towering glass headquarters of Rhodes Global Technologies. The 48-story building stood like a monument of wealth and authority in the center of the financial district, its mirrored exterior reflecting the gray morning sky, while black luxury SUVs lined the curb outside the entrance. Men in tailored navy suits hurried through the revolving doors carrying leather briefcases and steaming coffee cups, while reception staff greeted executives with polished smiles beneath crystal chandeliers that illuminated the marble lobby in warm gold light. But a few yards away from the crowd, a yellow taxi slowly pulled to the curb. The driver stepped out first, moving around to open the rear passenger door as a woman in a simple beige sweater quietly emerged, holding an old black umbrella against the rain. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about her appearance. No designer labels, no jewelry flashing beneath the city lights, no assistants surrounding her with clipboards or phones. Her dark blonde hair was tied back neatly, and the only thing she carried was a worn leather tote bag resting against her shoulder. Most people passing by barely looked at her twice, but the woman's calm blue eyes carefully studied the building in silence. Evelyn Rhodes had built this company 22 years earlier inside a rented garage with 2 computers and a folding table. Now Rhodes Global Technologies was worth nearly $40 billion, employing over 30,000 people across the country. Yet, despite her success, Evelyn had never enjoyed attention. She hated interviews, avoided celebrity events, and unlike most billionaires whose faces appeared constantly on television, many employees inside her own corporation had never actually met her in person, which was exactly why she had chosen to arrive alone that morning. Over the past 6 months, anonymous complaints had quietly landed on her desk from employees describing a growing culture of arrogance inside the company's leadership. Stories of receptionists mocking delivery drivers, junior staff being ignored in meetings, security humiliating visitors they considered unimportant. Small moments of disrespect spreading through the organization like cracks beneath polished marble floors. Evelyn wanted to see the truth with her own eyes, so she had told no one except the board chairman that she would be visiting headquarters unannounced. As she approached the entrance, the giant glass doors reflected her modest appearance back at her while executives brushed past without acknowledgement. Then suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the sound of rainfall. "Ma'am, hold on right there." Evelyn stopped calmly. Standing near the security gates was a tall man in his early 50s wearing a dark gray suit with a silver security badge clipped to his chest. Grant Callahan, head of corporate security, had built a reputation inside the company for strict professionalism and absolute control over the building. His posture radiated authority as he stepped directly into Evelyn's path, eyes narrowing slightly as he examined her from head to toe. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite. Evelyn offered a polite smile. "Good morning. I'm here for the executive board meeting." For half a second, Grant stared at her. Then came a small laugh beneath his breath. The executive board meeting? Around them, several employees slowed their pace just enough to listen. Evelyn remained composed. "Yes." Grant glanced toward her old tote bag before looking back at her sweater and rain-speckled shoes. "Do you have an employee badge?" "No." "An appointment confirmation?" "No." His expression hardened immediately. Then, "I'm afraid this area is restricted." Evelyn's voice stayed soft. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." But Grant had already folded his arms across his chest. "Ma'am, this building hosts some of the most important executives in the country. We can't have random people wandering into private meetings." Nearby employees began exchanging quiet glances while a young receptionist awkwardly looked down at her desk computer. Evelyn could already feel the atmosphere shifting around her, the subtle humiliation beginning to build beneath the polished professionalism of the lobby. Still, She never raised her voice. She simply looked at Grant steadily and said, "Are you certain you want to handle this publicly?" Grant's jaw tightened. To him, she looked like another outsider trying to bluff her way into an elite corporate tower. And in front of dozens of watching employees, he had no intention of backing down. What he didn't realize was that every word spoken in that lobby over the next few minutes would change his career forever. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass walls as the room slowly began to fall silent. Grant Callahan had spent 15 years building his reputation inside Rhodes Global Technologies, and in his mind, allowing someone like Evelyn past the lobby without credentials would make him look weak in front of the executive staff flooding into the building that morning. The rain outside intensified slightly, streaking across the enormous glass windows while the marble floors echoed with hurried footsteps and quiet whispers. More employees had begun slowing down near the security gates now, pretending to check phones or adjust briefcases while secretly watching the uncomfortable confrontation unfold. Evelyn stood quietly beneath the soft chandelier lighting, one hand resting on the strap of her weathered leather bag, while Grant maintained his rigid posture in front of her like a barrier protecting the tower behind him. "I am going to ask you one final time," Grant said firmly. "Who exactly are you here to meet?" Evelyn's expression remained calm. "The board of directors." A faint smirk crossed Grant's face. "Right." Several nearby employees exchanged awkward glances. One young intern looked visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared interrupt the head of corporate security. Grant took another step closer, lowering his voice slightly, though still loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Listen, ma'am. This company does not allow unauthorized visitors into executive meetings. If you are here for a job interview or a vendor appointment, you need to check in downstairs through visitor processing." Evelyn slowly removed a raindrop from the sleeve of her sweater. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Something about her composure irritated Grant even more. Most people backed down once confronted publicly. They became nervous, embarrassed, defensive. But Evelyn simply stood there with an almost unsettling calmness, as if she already understood how this situation would end. Behind the reception desk, two assistants quietly whispered to each other while elevator doors continued opening and closing nearby, releasing executives dressed in charcoal suits and polished leather shoes. One senior manager glanced toward Evelyn briefly before dismissing her entirely and walking away without concern. Grant noticed the audience growing larger around them, and his pride pushed him further. "Do you realize how serious this building's security protocols are?" he asked. "This is not some public courthouse or shopping center. We have billion-dollar negotiations happening upstairs right now." Evelyn met his gaze evenly. "Then I would hope professionalism matters even more." The words landed softly, but they carried enough weight to make the receptionist glance up again. Grant's jaw tightened immediately. "Professionalism?" he repeated. "Professionalism starts with respecting procedures." Evelyn nodded once. "And respect for people." For the first time, Grant hesitated. Only for a second, but it was enough for the tension in the lobby to shift slightly. Then his expression hardened again. "I am not debating corporate philosophy with someone who refuses to identify herself." He gestured toward the glass entrance behind her. "Now either you leave voluntarily, or I will have security escort you out." The room grew quieter. Even the clicking heels crossing the marble floor seemed to fade beneath the pressure building inside the lobby. Evelyn looked around slowly at the employees watching from a distance. Young analysts, administrative staff, junior assistants pretending not to stare. She recognized the same silent fear she had been hearing about in anonymous internal reports for months. Nobody wanted to challenge authority. Nobody wanted to risk humiliation becoming directed at them instead. That realization saddened her more than Grant's behavior itself. "Mr. Callahan," she said gently, reading his silver name badge for the first time. "Have you worked here long?" The question caught him off guard. "Long enough. Then you probably remember what this company was built on." He crossed his arms. "What this company was built on is discipline." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly. "No, it was built on dignity." A faint silence settled over the crowd again. Somewhere near the elevators, someone stopped typing on a phone. Grant let out a cold laugh beneath his breath. "You know, people like you always think confidence can replace credentials." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "People like me?" The question hung heavily in the air. Grant immediately realized several employees were listening closely now, but instead of pulling back, his frustration only deepened. "Look around," he said, gesturing toward the executives entering the elevators. "This is a professional environment. The people walking through these doors earn their place here." Evelyn followed his gesture calmly. "And how exactly do you determine who belongs?" Before Grant could answer, the private executive elevator at the far end of the lobby suddenly chimed softly. The polished silver doors slid open with mechanical precision, and within seconds, the entire atmosphere inside the building began to change. The polished silver doors of the executive elevator slid open with a quiet mechanical hum, and within seconds, the energy inside the lobby shifted so suddenly it almost felt physical. 3 members of the Rhodes Global Board stepped out first, dressed in dark tailored suits, followed closely by senior legal advisors and department executives carrying tablets and briefing folders. Their conversations stopped the moment they looked up. At the center of the group was Martin Ellsworth, the company's 70-year-old board chairman, whose presence alone could silence entire conference rooms. The moment his eyes landed on Evelyn standing beside the security gates, his face changed completely. "Ms. Rhodes," he said immediately, stepping forward with visible concern. "We have all been waiting for you upstairs." The lobby froze. Every sound seemed to disappear at once. Grant Callahan's expression emptied as though his mind could not process what he had just heard. Around him, employees stared in stunned silence while several executives near the elevators suddenly straightened their posture. Evelyn remained calm, though the sadness in her eyes deepened slightly as she looked toward the crowd gathering nearby. Martin reached her quickly. "I apologize for the confusion," he said carefully. "Your arrival details were intentionally kept private." Grant blinked once, then twice. His confident posture began collapsing almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Rhodes?" he repeated quietly. One of the younger executives standing behind Martin looked toward Grant with disbelief. "You stopped her at the gate?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The silence itself became the answer. Grant's face slowly lost color as realization crashed into him piece by piece. The simple woman standing in front of him was not an outsider. She was not a visitor. She was not an applicant. She was Evelyn Rhodes, founder of the company, chief executive officer. The woman whose name covered the side of the building itself in silver letters 40 feet tall. Several employees instinctively stepped backward. A receptionist lowered her eyes immediately, while 2 junior analysts near the coffee station exchanged horrified glances. Grant opened his mouth once, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he looked completely uncertain. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice remained soft enough that people leaned in to hear it. "Mr. Callahan asked me who belonged in this building." Nobody moved. I was curious about his answer too. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The humiliation hanging over the marble lobby now was heavier than shouting could ever create. Martin Ellsworth glanced briefly toward Grant before carefully adjusting his cufflinks. "We should proceed upstairs, Ms. Rhodes. The board meeting is ready." Evelyn nodded slowly, but she did not immediately move toward the elevator. Instead, her eyes drifted across the lobby again, studying the faces around her. Fear, embarrassment, anxiety. But beneath all of it, she also noticed something else. Employees watching quietly with the expression of people finally seeing truth exposed in daylight. Grant attempted to recover some control over the situation. "Ma'am, his voice cracked slightly before he cleared his throat. "I did not recognize you." Evelyn looked at him evenly. That was the point. Another heavy silence settled across the room. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a phone continued ringing unanswered. Grant swallowed hard. "I was only following security protocol." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Security protocol required public humiliation. Grant immediately lowered his eyes. No response came. Because there was none. Martin's expression tightened subtly, though years of executive discipline kept his emotions carefully restrained. Several board members now looked openly uncomfortable as they pieced together what had happened before they arrived. One female executive quietly shook her head under her breath. Evelyn stepped closer to the security gates, her calm presence somehow making the entire lobby feel smaller. "You know what concerns me most, Mr. Callahan?" she asked gently. "It is not that you stopped me." Grant looked up cautiously. "It is how many people watched it happen and believed your behavior was normal." The sentence landed harder than any public reprimand could have. Employees standing nearby immediately looked away. A young assistant clutched her tablet tighter against her chest, while another executive shifted awkwardly beside the elevators. Because Evelyn was right. Nobody had intervened. Nobody had questioned the humiliation unfolding in front of them. They had simply accepted it as part of the culture inside the building. And suddenly, under the bright chandelier lights reflecting against the marble floors, that culture no longer looked powerful. It looked ugly. Evelyn finally turned toward the executive elevator beside Martin Ellsworth. But before stepping inside, she paused one final time. "Cancel the first item on today's board agenda," she said calmly. "We are going to discuss company culture instead." Then she entered the elevator. And as the silver doors slowly closed, the entire lobby remained absolutely silent. The private executive elevator climbed silently toward the top floor while the tension inside remained almost unbearable. Martin Ellsworth stood beside Evelyn with his hands folded carefully in front of him, avoiding unnecessary conversation as the other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak after what had just happened downstairs. The polished steel walls reflected the quiet discomfort spreading through the group, while soft instrumental music played faintly overhead, creating an almost surreal contrast against the humiliation still hanging in everyone's mind. Evelyn remained calm, her eyes fixed on the changing floor numbers above the elevator doors. But behind her composed expression, disappointment weighed heavily on her thoughts. She had founded Rhodes Global Technologies with a completely different vision decades earlier. Back then, there were no marble lobbies, no executive elevators, no private dining floors reserved for leadership. The company had begun with 12 employees sharing folding chairs inside a freezing warehouse office outside Milwaukee. Evelyn still remembered bringing homemade coffee for exhausted programmers working through the night because nobody could afford assistants or catering. Every person mattered back then. Receptionists knew engineers by name. Executives carried their own boxes. Nobody cared about titles because survival depended on mutual respect. Somewhere along the road to success, that culture had started disappearing beneath polished appearances and corporate ego. The elevator doors finally opened onto the executive floor, revealing an enormous hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Rain clouds rolled across the skyline while assistants immediately stood from their desks as Evelyn stepped forward. "Good morning, Ms. Rhodes," several voices said nervously at once. Evelyn acknowledged them politely, but her attention quickly shifted toward the massive boardroom at the end of the hall. Through the glass walls, she could already see presentations glowing across digital screens prepared for the quarterly expansion meeting. Charts, revenue forecasts, international merger discussions, billion-dollar strategies waiting on polished walnut tables. Yet none of it mattered to her now. As the board entered the room, conversation immediately stopped. Executives seated around the long conference table straightened visibly the moment Evelyn walked in wearing the same modest sweater she had arrived in downstairs. Some looked confused by her appearance. Others sensed immediately that something serious had happened. Evelyn slowly placed her worn leather tote beside her chair at the head of the table. Then she remained standing. "Before we begin," she said quietly, "I would like everyone here to understand something very clearly." Her voice was calm, but the atmosphere inside the room shifted instantly. "This morning, I entered our headquarters without identification on purpose." Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. Martin Ellsworth carefully removed his glasses and folded them on the table. Evelyn continued, "Over the last 6 months, I have received anonymous reports from employees describing arrogance, humiliation, and elitism spreading throughout this company." A senior vice president frowned slightly. "Ms. Rhodes, if this is about the incident downstairs, it is not only about downstairs," Evelyn interrupted softly. The executive immediately fell silent. What happened in the lobby today simply confirmed what many people inside this organization already feel every single day. Nobody moved. Rain tapped gently against the massive windows overlooking the city while the quiet hum of air conditioning filled the silence between her words. Evelyn looked around the room. Slowly, making eye contact with each executive one by one. "Do you know what I saw this morning?" she asked. "I saw employees too uncomfortable to speak when someone was publicly humiliated right in front of them. Several faces tightened. I saw a leadership that mistakes intimidation for professionalism. One executive lowered his eyes toward the conference table, and I saw a company beginning to value appearances more than character. The words settled heavily across the room. Evelyn finally sat down at the head of the table, but her calmness somehow made the tension worse. Because nobody could accuse her of emotional overreaction. Every sentence was measured, controlled, precise. Grant Callahan believed he was protecting the company image, she continued. But the truth is this. The image of a company is not created by architecture or stock prices. It is created by how people with power treat people they believe have none. Silence followed again, long enough that several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Then finally, the chief financial officer spoke carefully. What would you like us to do? Evelyn looked toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the glass windows before answering. First, I want every executive in this room to spend the next 30 days working anonymously alongside regular staff. Confusion spread immediately across several faces. Reception desks, customer support, security checkpoints, cafeterias, entry floors. Her blue eyes sharpened slightly for the first time all morning. Because somewhere along the way, too many people inside this building forgot what dignity looks like when it stands directly in front of them. And once again, the room went completely silent. The announcement spread through Rhodes Global Technologies faster than any quarterly earnings report ever had. By lunchtime, employees across all 48 floors were whispering about the scene in the lobby that morning. Executives who normally walked through the building with quiet superiority suddenly looked tense and distracted while assistants exchanged stunned versions of the story near coffee stations and break rooms. Some employees could hardly believe it was true. Others admitted privately that they were not surprised at all, because deep down, many of them had felt the culture changing for years. The polished image of excellence had slowly become something colder, more judgmental, more performative. And now, for the first time, someone powerful enough to confront it had seen everything with her own eyes. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere remained heavy long after Evelyn finished speaking. Nobody touched the catered breakfast sitting untouched along the side tables. Fresh fruit, pastries, imported coffee. Normally, executives would have been discussing market forecasts and acquisition strategies by now. Instead, silence lingered beneath the recessed lighting while rain continued sliding down the enormous windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Martin Ellsworth finally leaned forward carefully. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you are proposing significant operational disruption." "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "I am proposing perspective." Several executives shifted in their seats again. The chief operations officer cleared his throat cautiously. "With respect, Ms. Rhodes, one incident involving security should not define the entire company culture." Evelyn looked toward him steadily. "One incident never defines culture," she said softly. "Patterns do." Nobody responded, because everyone in the room understood she was right. Human resources reports had increased over the last year. Employee turnover had quietly climbed. Customer service complaints mentioning dismissive behavior had become more frequent. Individually, each issue seemed small. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Evelyn slowly folded her hands together on the conference table. "Do you know why companies fail?" she asked. A few executives exchanged uncertain looks. "It is rarely because they stop making money first. They fail because they stop seeing people clearly." Her words settled heavily across the room again. Arrogance enters quietly. It starts with small humiliations everyone excuses because they seem insignificant. Martin removed his glasses slowly, listening carefully. Evelyn continued. A receptionist mocking. A delivery driver. A manager embarrassing an intern in front of a team. Security deciding who belongs based on clothing instead of character. The memory of Grant standing beneath the chandelier lights flashed uncomfortably through several minds. Eventually, Evelyn said, people stop feeling respected. Then they stop caring. And once that happens, no amount of revenue can save a company long term. Across the table, the chief marketing officer lowered her eyes slightly. She remembered overhearing executives joke about cafeteria workers only weeks earlier. At the time, nobody challenged it. Nobody wanted conflict. But now the silence surrounding those moments suddenly felt far more serious. Evelyn stood from her chair and walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city below. Tiny yellow taxis moved through rain-covered streets, while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas 30 floors beneath them. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment over a hardware store in Milwaukee, she said quietly. Several executives looked surprised. She rarely spoke about her personal life. My father worked 60 hours a week and still worried about grocery bills. Her reflection stared back at her against the glass skyline. When I started this company, I promised myself something. If we ever became successful, nobody inside these walls would be treated as less important because of appearance, status, or income. The room remained completely still. Evelyn turned back toward the board. This morning, I watched employees become afraid to defend basic dignity because authority was standing nearby. The words hit harder now because nobody could deny them. That is not leadership, she continued. That is fear disguised as professionalism. The legal advisor sitting near the end of the table adjusted his tie nervously. What happens to Mr. Callahan? Evelyn paused briefly before answering. Right now? Her expression remained composed. He waits. Several executives looked surprised by the answer. One of them finally asked carefully, "You are not firing him?" Evelyn shook her head once. Punishment without understanding changes nothing. Then her eyes sharpened slightly. But accountability matters. Downstairs, meanwhile, Grant Callahan sat alone inside his office behind the security command center, replaying every second of the morning in his head. The surveillance monitors glowing across the walls no longer made him feel powerful. For years he had believed strict control protected the company image. But now another realization had started creeping slowly into his mind. Maybe he had not been protecting the company at all. Maybe he had become part of the very problem standing at its front door. And somewhere high above the city, Evelyn Rhodes quietly prepared to force the entire corporation to confront the same truth. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Rhodes Global Technologies no longer resembled the polished corporate machine employees were accustomed to. The building still gleamed beneath warm chandelier lighting. Executives still moved through marble hallways carrying tablets and reports. But beneath the expensive architecture, something deeper had shifted. People were talking honestly for the first time in months. In quiet corners of break rooms and elevators, employees began sharing stories they normally kept to themselves. A receptionist admitted she once watched a janitor get mocked by a senior manager for using the executive coffee station. A customer support specialist confessed she stopped offering ideas during meetings after being publicly dismissed for attending a state college instead of an Ivy League university. Even some executives privately acknowledged that the company had become obsessed with image and hierarchy in ways they no longer recognized. Meanwhile, inside his office near the lobby security center, Grant Callahan sat alone staring at the surveillance footage from earlier that morning. The monitors cast pale blue light across the room, while rain continued sliding down the glass windows outside. He had replayed the footage 6 times already. Every word, every expression, every moment Evelyn stood calmly in front of him while he reduced her to an inconvenience standing outside the gates of her own company. The worst part was not discovering who she was afterward. The worst part was realizing how natural his behavior had felt at the time. Grant leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaustion pulling heavily at his face. For years he had convinced himself that strictness was leadership, that projecting authority maintained order, that intimidating people prevented weakness from spreading inside the company. But watching the footage now from a distance, he saw something different. He did not look professional. He looked arrogant. Worse than that, he looked proud of humiliating someone he believed lacked status. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said hoarsely. The door opened carefully, revealing a young security officer named Tyler Bennett. Barely 26 years old, Tyler had worked under Grant for almost 2 years. "Sir," Tyler said nervously, "Ms. Rhodes wants to see you upstairs." Grant's stomach tightened immediately. For several seconds, he said nothing. Tyler shifted awkwardly near the doorway. "The boardroom?" Grant finally asked. "No, sir," Tyler answered softly. "Her office." The room fell silent again. Grant slowly stood, adjusting his gray suit jacket with noticeably unsteady hands. For the first time in over a decade, the powerful head of security looked uncertain walking through his own building. Employees glanced up quietly as he crossed the lobby toward the executive elevators. Nobody whispered this time. Nobody smirked. The atmosphere felt too serious for gossip now. When the elevator doors finally opened on the top floor, an assistant quietly guided Grant toward Evelyn's private office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The office itself surprised him immediately. There was no excessive luxury inside. No gold decorations. No oversized displays of wealth. Just warm lighting, shelves filled with worn books, framed photographs of early employees, and a simple wooden desk facing enormous windows overlooking the rain-covered city. Evelyn stood near the glass with a cup of coffee in her hands when Grant entered. "Close the door, please," she said gently. Grant obeyed immediately. For a few uncomfortable seconds, neither of them spoke. Then finally Grant lowered his eyes. "Ms. Rhodes, I owe you an apology." Evelyn remained quiet. What happened downstairs was unacceptable. His voice sounded heavier now, stripped of the sharp authority he normally carried. "I judged you based on appearance, and I embarrassed you publicly." Evelyn studied him carefully. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because I did not recognize you," he answered quickly. "No," Evelyn said softly. "Why did you believe someone dressed simply deserved humiliation in the first place?" The room fell completely still. Grant opened his mouth slightly, but no answer came. Because for the first time, he realized he had never truly questioned that assumption before. Evelyn slowly set her coffee cup down beside the window. "You know what troubles me most, Mr. Callahan?" she asked quietly. "You are not a cruel man." Grant looked up, confused. "Cruel people enjoy causing pain," she continued. "You believed you were doing your job." Her words landed harder than anger would have. "That is what makes this dangerous. When disrespect becomes normalized inside an organization, decent people stop noticing it." Grant stared silently at the city skyline beyond the windows. Somewhere below, headlights reflected across wet Chicago streets while thunder rolled faintly in the distance. "I built this company because my father spent his entire life being treated as invisible," Evelyn said quietly. "He repaired machinery at a manufacturing plant for 37 years. Most executives never learned his name." Grant listened carefully now. When he walked into expensive buildings, people looked through him like he did not matter. Her blue eyes reflected the storm clouds outside. "I promised myself that if I ever had power, nobody under my leadership would feel that way." Grant lowered his head slowly, and for the first time all day, the weight of what he had done truly settled into his chest. Grant Callahan left Evelyn Rhodes's office carrying a weight that felt heavier than any threat to his career. The conversation had lasted less than 20 minutes, yet somehow it forced him to confront things he had ignored about himself for years. As the executive elevator carried him back toward the lower floors, he stared silently at his own reflection. In the polished steel walls, the same sharp suit, the same silver badge, the same posture of authority he had worn proudly every day. But now he could no longer separate that image from the man standing in the lobby, humiliating someone he believed lacked importance. For the first time in a long while, Grant felt ashamed not because he had been exposed publicly, but because he finally understood the kind of example he had become inside the company. Downstairs, the atmosphere across the building remained unusually subdued. Employees spoke more carefully to one another. Executives who normally rushed past reception desks without acknowledgement now paused to say good morning. Even small interactions seemed different, as though everyone suddenly realized they were being forced to see things that had always existed beneath the polished corporate image. Near the lobby coffee station, two young analysts quietly discussed what happened that morning. "Honestly," one admitted softly, "I have seen people treated like that here before." The other nodded. "Me too. Just never someone powerful enough to stop it." Their conversation ended the moment Grant walked past them. Normally, employees straightened nervously when the head of security approached. But this time something else happened. The fear was gone. Not completely, but enough that Grant noticed the difference immediately. People were no longer intimidated by him in the same way. And strangely, he realized that might actually be healthier. Inside the security office, Tyler Bennett looked up anxiously as Grant entered. "Sir." Grant slowly removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of his chair. "Cancel the visitor restriction review for tomorrow," he said quietly. Tyler blinked in surprise. "The one involving dress code enforcement?" Grant nodded once. "Effective immediately." Tyler hesitated. "Should I notify upper management?" Grant looked toward the glowing surveillance monitors lining the walls. "Upper management already knows." The young officer studied him carefully. For 2 years, Tyler had watched Grant operate with rigid confidence, rarely questioning his own decisions. But the man standing in front of him now looked different somehow. Less certain, more human. Grant lowered himself slowly into his chair. "Tyler," he asked after a moment, "have you ever felt uncomfortable with how we handle people here?" The younger man froze slightly. For several seconds, he seemed unsure whether answering honestly would be dangerous. Then finally he spoke quietly. "Sometimes." Grant gave a faint nod. "I figured." Tyler shifted awkwardly. "Most of us just thought that was how corporate security was supposed to work." The words landed painfully because Grant recognized himself in them immediately. That was exactly what Evelyn meant upstairs. Disrespect had become normalized so gradually that decent people stopped questioning it. Across the building, meanwhile, Evelyn walked quietly through departments without announcement or entourage. She visited customer service floors, employee cafeterias, reception areas. She listened far more than she spoke. And everywhere she went, employees seemed both nervous and strangely relieved to finally tell the truth. One receptionist admitted she had once been instructed by a supervisor to prioritize visitors based on clothing and appearance. A maintenance worker described being ignored for years despite helping prevent major equipment failures throughout the building. A junior programmer confessed he stopped speaking during meetings after executives mocked his accent during a presentation. None of the stories involved dramatic cruelty. That was what made them so dangerous. They were small humiliations repeated often enough to slowly shape the company culture itself. By evening, storm clouds had finally begun clearing above Chicago, allowing pale orange sunlight to spill across the glass towers downtown. Evelyn stood alone inside the now quiet lobby, looking toward the same security gates where Grant had stopped her that morning. The marble floors reflected the fading sunset, while the building gradually emptied around her. Martin Ellsworth approached carefully from behind. "Long day," he said softly. Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Important day." Martin studied her expression. "You know the board expected you to terminate Grant immediately." Evelyn remained silent for a moment before answering. Removing one man would be easy. Her eyes drifted toward employees exiting through the revolving doors. Changing an entire culture is harder. Martin nodded slowly. "Do you think he understands what he did?" Evelyn looked back toward the security office where Grant still sat reviewing procedures with Tyler. "I think today was the first time he ever truly saw himself clearly." The chandelier lights glowed warmly across the enormous lobby as evening settled over the city outside. And somewhere deep within Rhodes Global Technologies, something far more important than company policy had finally begun to change. The following Monday morning, Rhodes Global Technologies looked almost identical from the outside. The same towering glass walls reflected the sunrise over downtown Chicago. Black sedans still lined the curb outside the entrance. Executives still crossed the marble lobby carrying coffee cups and presentation folders. But beneath the polished routines, the building felt different now. Quieter, more aware of itself somehow. Employees noticed subtle changes immediately. Senior managers who normally ignored reception staff suddenly greeted them by name. Department heads began eating in the public cafeteria instead of private executive dining rooms. Even elevator conversations sounded less performative, stripped of some invisible pressure that had hovered over the company for years. The changes were small, almost unremarkable individually. Yet together they signaled something far larger beginning to shift inside the culture of the corporation. At exactly 8:15 that morning, Grant Callahan stood once again beside the security gates in the main lobby. But this time, his posture carried none of the rigid arrogance employees once associated with him. He greeted maintenance workers as they entered, helped an elderly visitor locate the correct conference room personally, thanked a delivery driver carrying heavy equipment cases through the revolving doors. Several employees noticed the difference immediately. Some looked surprised. Others looked skeptical. After all, people did not change overnight. Grant understood that better than anyone. The humiliation he experienced last week had not magically transformed him into a different man, but it had forced him to confront truths he could no longer ignore. And for the first time in years, he was trying to lead without intimidation. Around 9 o'clock, the lobby doors opened again as a nervous young woman stepped inside carrying a weathered backpack and a folder pressed tightly against her chest. She looked no older than 23. Her navy blazer was slightly oversized, and rain from outside still clung to her shoes. The moment she entered the enormous lobby, anxiety crossed her face. Grant recognized the expression instantly now. The feeling of believing you did not belong somewhere important. The young woman approached the security desk cautiously. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I am here for an interview with software development." Grant glanced at the schedule. Name: Elena Ramirez. He found her immediately on the visitor list. But before he could answer, a sharply dressed executive walking nearby slowed just enough to glance toward Elena's backpack and worn shoes with visible judgment. The look lasted only a second, but Grant saw it, because now he understood exactly what those moments looked like. Elena noticed it too. Her shoulders tightened slightly as she lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. A week earlier, Grant might have ignored the interaction completely, or worse, reinforced it. Instead, he stepped out from behind the security desk personally. "Welcome to Rhodes Global, Ms. Ramirez," he said calmly. "Your interview team is expecting you upstairs." Elena blinked in surprise. Grant handed her a visitor badge with both hands instead of sliding it across the desk carelessly like before. "Software development is on the 32nd floor," he explained. "And for what it is worth, some of the best engineers in this company arrive carrying backpacks instead of briefcases." The nervousness in Elena's expression softened slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Nearby employees exchanged subtle glances as she entered the elevator. The executive who had judged her earlier quickly looked away. Grant returned slowly to his security station, but before he sat down, another voice spoke from behind him. "Better." He turned immediately. Evelyn Rhodes stood near the entrance holding the same old black umbrella from the previous week. No entourage. No dramatic announcement, just quiet observation. Grant straightened instinctively. "Good morning, Ms. Rhodes." Evelyn glanced toward the elevator Elena had just entered. "You noticed the look on her face?" Grant nodded slowly. "I never used to." Evelyn studied him carefully for a moment. Then finally she said something Grant did not expect. "Most people never do." The morning sunlight reflected softly across the marble floors while employees continued flowing through the lobby around them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Grant lowered his voice slightly. "I keep thinking about what you said." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "About your father?" Grant nodded once. "About invisible people." Evelyn's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Every company has them," she said quietly. "People who hold the entire organization together while others walk past them without ever learning their names." Grant looked around the lobby differently now. Security officers, custodians, reception staff, delivery workers, people he had once measured only by appearance and status. "I spent years believing authority meant making people feel small," he admitted. Evelyn shook her head gently. "Real authority makes people feel safe." The words settled heavily between them, not as punishment, but as truth. And standing beneath the golden morning light pouring through the glass walls of Rhodes Global Technologies, Grant finally understood the difference. 3 months later, the atmosphere inside Rhodes Global Technologies had transformed in ways no executive report could fully measure. The company still dominated headlines for innovation and billion-dollar expansion deals. But internally, something far more meaningful had begun rebuilding itself quietly from the ground up. Employee turnover had dropped for the first time in nearly 2 years. Customer satisfaction scores had climbed steadily. More importantly, people inside the company no longer walked through the building feeling invisible. Reception staff were included in leadership appreciation events. Junior employees spoke more confidently during meetings. Executives rotated regularly through customer support and operations departments exactly as Evelyn demanded. At first, many senior leaders resisted the changes privately. Some considered them unnecessary. Others viewed them as symbolic public relations gestures. But over time, even the most skeptical executives began noticing something undeniable. Teams performed better when people felt respected. Departments communicated more honestly when fear disappeared from the culture. Productivity improved not because employees were pressured harder, but because they finally felt valued. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Evelyn walked once again through the main lobby carrying her old leather tote bag and black umbrella. She still dressed simply, still arrived without an entourage whenever possible. But now employees greeted her differently. not with exaggerated corporate politeness, but with genuine warmth. "Good afternoon, Ms. Rhodes. Nice to see you today. The mentorship program has been amazing." She acknowledged each person quietly by name whenever she could. Because unlike many executives, Evelyn believed leadership started with noticing people others overlooked. Near the security gates, Grant Callahan stood helping an elderly visitor print temporary credentials from the kiosk. He patiently explained each step instead of rushing her aside. When he noticed Evelyn approaching, he offered a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, Ms. Rhodes." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Busy day?" Grant glanced around the crowded lobby. "Always." But this time, there was calmness in his voice rather than control. Over the past 3 months, Grant had changed more than anyone expected. He began holding weekly meetings with security staff focused not only on safety procedures, but on communication and respect. He removed appearance-based screening practices entirely. He personally apologized to several employees he had intimidated over the years. Not everyone forgave him immediately. Some remained cautious around him. Grant accepted that quietly. He understood trust returned slowly. What mattered was that he no longer hid behind authority to avoid self-reflection. Nearby, Tyler Bennett watched the interaction while assisting visitors at the desk. He still remembered the man Grant used to be before that morning changed everything. And perhaps the most surprising part was this. Grant himself never tried to erase what happened. Instead, he used it as a reminder of how easily power could distort perspective if left unquestioned. Evelyn paused near the security gates where their first confrontation happened months earlier. Sunlight now poured through the enormous glass walls instead of storm clouds, illuminating the marble floors in warm gold reflections. Employees moved confidently through the lobby while conversations and quiet laughter echoed softly around the building. It felt alive again. Grant followed her gaze toward the entrance. "I used to think professionalism meant making people prove they belonged," he admitted quietly. Evelyn looked toward the revolving doors where delivery workers, executives, interns, and visitors entered side by side. "And now," Grant gave a faint smile, "now I think people reveal who they are by how they treat someone before knowing their title." Evelyn nodded slowly. That lesson cost this company almost everything. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tyler approached carefully holding a folder. "Ms. Rhodes," he said, "I thought you might want to see this." Evelyn opened the folder and found dozens of handwritten notes collected from employees over the past several weeks. Messages thanking leadership for changing the company culture. Stories from workers who finally felt comfortable speaking during meetings. One short letter from a janitor simply read, "For the first time in 10 years, people here look me in the eye when they say good morning." Evelyn read the notes silently. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Around them, the lobby continued moving with quiet energy beneath the afternoon sunlight. No dramatic speeches. No applause. Just people treating one another with basic dignity again. Martin Ellsworth eventually stepped into the lobby carrying briefing folders for another board meeting. He glanced around at the atmosphere before smiling faintly toward Evelyn. "The building feels different now," he admitted. Evelyn closed the folder carefully. "Buildings do not change," she said softly. "People do." The revolving doors turned slowly as another wave of employees entered from the busy Chicago streets outside. Some wore expensive suits. Others carried backpacks and lunch bags. Some held executive titles, while others worked quietly behind the scenes. But inside Rhodes Global Technologies now, those differences no longer determined who deserved respect. And standing beneath the golden light reflecting across marble floors, the company finally remembered what real leadership was supposed to look like.